And I'm just wondering how you envision the United States' role in containing radical Islam in both the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah, no, great question. I think there's a couple different things. One, even before getting into some specifics in a little moment, but in particular, one of the biggest frustrations I've seen the last few years is when we've gutted the Department of Defense. Financially, because of sequester and other issues with this president, you see a military that's at disturbingly low levels. And I think going forward, we need to get our budget under control. There's reforms we need to put in place. There's things I talked about where we need to move power and money out to the states from the federal government. But in one of the few areas where the federal government has a clearly defined and appropriate role is in the defense of our country and our interests. And we just don't have this right now. We have a Navy, for example, that is headed towards 250 vessels. That's about half of where it was under President Reagan. We have an Army where the ground force is about, throughout the world, is about where we were at the peak of the Cold War in Europe alone. And so we're at a very disturbingly low level. And I'm not eager to get in a war. Don't get me wrong on this. I'm not a bracelet guy, but I've got 3 bracelets on my arm here. They're all from Gold Star families. And I take that very seriously because I don't ever want to go to one of those funerals again. But I also know that for those men and for the men and women they represent, I don't ever want them to think that their sons or daughters had died in vain. And when I think about, now you're obviously quite a bit younger, but when I was in my teens in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was the president. One of the things people forget about is when he reestablished the strength of the United States military through putting appropriate levels of finances into its budget, and because of his strong stands overall, peace through strength was established by the fact that during that time, that 8 years, we had one of the lowest levels of military engagement. It wasn't because he was afraid to take action, it was because our foes knew he wasn't, and that he had the capacity to do that. And so, for starters, we need to reestablish an appropriate level of funding for the Pentagon for the military budget. Along with that, we need to make sure that in a series of these areas, when you think about, there's Iran, there's Iraq, there's ISIS, and there's Israel. So multiple eyes there. We need to start with reestablishing our base with Israel as an ally. We have not done that under this administration. In fact, we've sent disturbingly poor messages in inaction amongst Israel. I would not only do that, I think you do that to the point of one of the most symbolic things you can do off the bat is reestablish, put in place the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem where it belongs and not in Tel Aviv. I think that would send a powerful message not just to the Israelis, but to others around the world. Secondly, in this case, there's no particular order because ISIS, as well as Iran, I'd almost say Iran right now is an even bigger threat than ISIS, although they're pretty close. In the fact that Iran, if we're not able to pull back on at least the framework of this deal that's been proposed by this president, it is a huge problem, not just for Israel. It's a reason why the Gulf states, I've met with our allies in the Gulf states, not only Israel, but the Arab states in the Gulf territory are just as disturbed about this perceived deal with Iran as are the Israelis, and appropriately so. We need to act on pulling that back, and not just because they'll have a nuclear weapon capacity. This is a government that still has its supreme leader and others, when people are chanting death to America, in no way stops that. They validate that. They encourage that. This is a country that hasn't changed dramatically from the country that, when I was young, held for 444 days. Americans, including one of my friends, Kevin Hermiting, who was the youngest Marine, held hostage during that time frame. And so we need to pull back on that. This is a country that's once client states in places like Syria and in Yemen of their Shiite militias that are part of pushing these efforts out there. We need to be aggressive in that regard. And then with ISIS, I mean, this is one where I think it's something we need to lay out the details specifically, and that is, this is a generational issue. It's not going to happen with a few airstrikes. We're going to have to be committed. We're going to have a global coalition, which I think we can have not only with our traditional allies in Europe, but with places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others throughout the Middle East, and say that we're going to take on radical Islamic terrorism. And it's ultimately like a virus. You've got to take it out entirely or it'll come back stronger out there. So we need to do it in any of those areas and be committed to doing it going forward. Because it's not a matter of if, it's when. So way back here, I'll zoom around.
I'd like to hear your views with regard to the Soviet Union and their recent resurgence in Eastern Europe in particular, and perhaps even more than that. If you're elected president and get to serve 8 years, do you think the Chinese economy will overtake the U.S. economy? And if not, why not?
Well, a bunch of different interesting questions. On Russia and Putin, you know, this is one of our failures. I go back for a second to the question about the Middle East, but it ties into this. I just a week or two ago was meeting with a number of Arab country leaders, and I asked them, I said, before you even commented on the Iran deal, tell me, what do you think is the #1 concern you see in the world today? You know what the reaction was? The disengagement of America. Their #1 concern in the world. It wasn't just the Iran deal. And so I see it as well with what's happened in Ukraine with Russia. Remember, Putin is a nationalist. People forget about this, but after Gorbachev did the deal that he did back at the end of the 90s and or the end of the 80s into the 90s, there are people like Putin who disdained what Gorbachev did. They think they gave up too much. They think that this was, from a nationalist pride standpoint, they're very distraught about that. And so Putin very much believes in the adage that Lenin once had, which is you probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you pull back. Well, so far, Putin's found mush. When he went into the Crimean Peninsula, he's found mush. And there are many of us who worry if he continues to go further into Ukraine, or for that matter, into the Baltics, and then that escalates rather quickly, because the Baltics, unlike the Ukraine, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those 3 countries are part of NATO. Estonia, for example, is one of the few countries left in NATO that still spends at least 2% of their GDP on their defense. Places like the UK and Germany no longer do that, even though that's a requirement of NATO. And so there's a real concern out there. I think what the next president should do, whether I'm it or not, but I think this is what the next president should do. I think we need to be aggressive in working with NATO, not doing it single-handedly, but providing some forms of lethal assistance to the Ukraine government, and then potentially even looking to put NATO-backed American troops near the border in the Baltic states, because I think that sends a clear message. The same thing with fighter jets. You've already seen the Russians make attempts of late to try and fly into space. I do the same thing with Poland and others. I think you just have to send a clear message that things are different now, and I think you have a similar outcome to what we got with Reagan, which is it won't escalate, it will de-escalate some of the movements we've seen with Russia if they know that there's someone willing to be forceful. And in terms of the other question on China, China to me is in a weird situation. China is what I would define as a strategic competitor. They're not an outright opponent, they're not a foe, but they're not an outright ally either. So they are, in my view, they are what I would call a strategic competitor, meaning there are portions of our economy and theirs that are interwound, have been and will be increasing, particularly as the middle class rises, which we've seen dramatically happen in China, particularly as their economy slows down a bit, some of it because of unprecedented levels of borrowing at both the local and the provincial level. That has slowed things down. I've said for years, you know, their version of the housing crisis is when the bubble starts to burst with all these communities they built where there aren't any people in them. There's big apartment buildings where people own, because that's one of the few things Chinese can do, as an ambassador knows well, is knowing Chinese, understanding the Chinese government very well, but where they can make investments, you can own an additional home or apartment usually. Well, there's a lot of places that don't have people in them, and so there's a big question of where does the economy go in that regard. I would have thought, if you look, there's a great book that the head of Gallup Corporation wrote about 3 years ago called The Coming Jobs War, and the projection is 25 years out that the Chinese government would overtake the American. I don't believe that will happen. And to your last part of your question, here's why. When I was a kid, the same projection could have been made about Japan and Germany. And in one area they did, automobiles, Volkswagen and Toyota, Toyota are the #1 and 2 global automobile dealers, although Volkswagen is going to retake the #1 spot. So in German and Japanese automobiles they have, but they didn't overcome our overall economy. Why? because of places like Microsoft and Apple and Facebook, and that's uniquely American innovation and technology. And the reason I'm optimistic going forward, I think if we do enough with the next president and the next new Congress to get government out of the way, to allow capital to go where it normally flows, and not to have it go around tax burden or regulatory burden in a way that adds excess to that, but goes forward, I think we can encourage greater productivity, a higher labor participation rate, and most importantly, more investments in technology innovation that will help us catapult at a higher pace than the Chinese economy is projected to go over the next 20, 25 years. Sure.
And thank you, Governor, for being here. I have to go to church. Do you have any prayer requests?
I'll be at church tomorrow morning, but yeah, pray for my family. It's one thing as a candidate to run. It's much tougher on the spouse and the children. Although my kids are probably both in college, they're probably going to take a semester off if things head where they're headed and come and campaign. In fact, one of them, Matthew's going to be in New Hampshire just next week.
Well, good luck to you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where do you stand on Common Core, sir?
I oppose it. We were talking about this on the way in. When I first was governor, like most of the governors in 2010, Governor Bush, who I'm not going to speak ill of, is a friend of mine. But Governor Bush's foundation worked with a lot of governors on a lot of good things in education. We pushed stopping social promotion. We pushed a whole bunch of other things. But one of it was a discussion about this. Now in our state, we didn't have a vote on Common Core when I was in office. It was enacted before I took place. We have a separate, what's called the Superintendent of Public Instruction that handles all education, unlike many states where they have a cabinet level position. So if I want to make changes, I have to make it in the law, not just I can't tell the cabinet secretary. We had probably about 2013, when we started hearing from parents and educators and others who said, hey, what is this Common Core stuff? We looked into it, and that year we drafted legislation to move it to the state level. The legislature, unfortunately, didn't pass it then. Since then, when I ran last year for re-election, having met with even more parents on it, instead of sending it to the state level for a different, for the state to determine what the standards should be, increasingly, I just felt it should be left up to the local school board. So what I have in my budget is that there's a statutory change that says that no school board in our state has to go comply with Common Core, and financially we take out all the money for what's called Smarter Balanced, which is really the Common Core test.
Does that
we
commissioner,
remove all the, what's that?
the commissioner that you have as opposed to yours sounds different than ours. Does he have authority over the elected, or do the elected, in our state, the appointed have authority over the elected?
In every state's a little bit different, but in our state, the superintendent is elected.
The superintendent
They're elected
still
independently.
is elected.
So the superintendent of public instruction is historically overwhelmingly elected with the teachers union support, and so they have a very different agenda. But the governor and the legislature set the budget, and so if we want to make changes, that's when we have to do it through the budget or through the statutes.
But there's a balance of power, I think is what I hear you saying, so that one can't.
Yeah, there's not an appointed camp, but in this case, the superintendent's the one that can ultimately do that. So for us to change it, what we had to do per your question is literally take the money away for Smarter Balanced, and then put into the statutes the requirement that no school district, we have 424 school districts in our state, no school district has to be required to use that they can set whatever they want their standards to be at the local level. Now, I want high standards. Our schools, second best ACT scores in the country for states where more than half the kids take the ACT. So I'm not against high standards. I just want them set by people in state and ideally at the local school board. So I don't get the hook, but how about two quick ones here and here?
Governor, thank you for taking my question. Thank you for being here in Hampshire. How do you envision handling and dealing with what I call the secret government in Washington, which is the bureaucracy?
Yeah, two different things on that. Great question. And again, as we go further here, we'll lay out a big presentation of this, but I'll give you a preview of both. One is I believe firmly, as a state official, I particularly believe this, but I also think it goes to the larger problem, not just the states' rights, but just of the size and scope of the federal government. is I would take major portions of the federal government, send it back to states. I think you take, and the way I explain it is, if you take $1 out of your wallet or your purse and you look at it, where would you rather have that money spent? I mean, think about education. Where would you rather send it to Washington, where they take money off the top, they put it into this big bureaucracy in Washington, they give you a little or no value added, and then they send it back to your state, which eventually pennies on the dollar get to your school? Or would you rather just keep it in your state so go to your school? Right? It just makes more sense. And you can apply it to Medicaids, you can apply that to transportation, you can workforce development. Because there's like 150 different programs, most of which are good at hiring people to run the programs, but not at actually getting people the skills they need to get employed out there. So why not keep that off the state level? And I just firmly believe states more effective, more efficient, more accountable. And even if you have total Republican control at the federal level, it's almost impossible to get your arms around the size and scope of some of these federal bureaucracies. And why not take that back to the states? And then for things like national defense and a handful of other things, where it's appropriate, why not say, those are the areas we expect that the federal government does it well. The other thing I would tie into, and any of you in business know this particularly to be true, regulations. I mean, one of the things we're looking at, we're running the traps on this, so it's not an official proposal yet. We want to make sure we're not missing something here. But what about the idea, and I've had a number of people bring this up, and it's intriguing to me, of saying taking every federal regulation and pass legislation early on in the beginning of the first term for the next president that calls for a sunset on that legislation by the end of that first term. And then you put the onus on saying, if whatever's appropriate, and there aren't many, most people have complaints about things that get added onto a rider bill, but for whatever is legitimate and appropriate for public health and public safety, then make the case and have the Congress vote on it on a direct piece of legislation unattached to a right. And for those that aren't, they'll be gone by the end of the first term. So there's a whole series of rules and regulation that can be wiped out that are not only good for the American people overall, they're particularly good for American employers, because that's one of the biggest barriers, I think, to economic growth and prosperity in this country. So you get the last question.
Governor, it's great to see you back in New Hampshire. Thank you so much for coming.
Good to be back.
It's great to see a really nice collection of just all different aspects of the Republican Party here. Tell us about should you decide to run, tell us about your strategy, how much you're going to be committed to New Hampshire, what maybe folks in this room can do to buoy your candidacy.
Great, that's great. Good way to end. I didn't set that up, but I'm going to plant you in more places. Well, first off, it's interesting because even though Wisconsin's a little bit, not much bigger, but a little bit bigger, although I was kidding with somebody before who was from Wisconsin, then moved out here, served in the legislature, that Wisconsin's almost identical if you took the upper 2/3 of our state. If you take off Milwaukee and Madison, which politically would probably be all right with us too, but both in size and in terms of even geography and demographics and that. So there's a lot of similarities. I'll probably come back, well, I'll be back between now and then, but June I'll probably come back for Bike Week because I ride a Harley. And have some good fun coming around the state. I actually did that in my previous campaigns. I ride my Road King around on weekends with about 150 other bikers, and that's our whistle stop, if you will. It's a little more fun, but that'll be something unique. But I think that would go over well here. On a weekend, I'd probably hit all 10 counties and make our way around from one end of the state to the other. So we'll do things like that, a lot of interaction, a lot of town hall meetings, presence. I mean, I've done that repeatedly in the last 3 elections in the past 4 years. So I'm pretty comfortable doing that, pretty comfortable going from small towns to big cities and everywhere in between. But I think the demographics in many ways are similar. For us to win in a state that probably is more blue than red, we had to carry almost universal support amongst Republicans. 96%. So that's Tea Party to establishment, from social conservatives to libertarian, everyone in between. And I think there's a trend, there's a sense of that. There's a broad spectrum of Republican-leaning voters here. We do well with all this. We're one of the few potential campaigns that candidates that can actually do well in every one of those grids I just mentioned. But to win in my last 3 elections, I had to do more than just win almost universal support amongst Republicans. We had to carry independents by 11 to 12 points. What I found, and this sounds unusual, but the biggest thing that helps win independents and still carry your base so strong is the same thing. Leadership. looking people straight in the eye and tell them exactly what you're gonna do, and then have them feel confident that no matter what happens, you're actually gonna follow through on it. I think our story about what we did, taking out all those protesters and everything else, isn't just about, regardless of what you think about labor and unions and things like that, people can say, hey, this guy, he fights and he wins for hardworking people like me. And I think in a state like New Hampshire, that's important because Hillary Clinton's gonna be largely unopposed, if not officially unopposed. And so you're gonna have crossover, you're gonna have certainly independents, maybe even some Democrats. And so to do well in a primary here, you've gotta not only shore up as much of your base as possible, you've gotta show an appeal to independent voters in particular. That says, you know, when the chips are down, I don't need you to be with me on every single issue. I just need to feel confident that you're gonna tell it like it is and then go act on it. And I think that's appealing, not just in a primary. I think that's potentially appealing. We want to build an organization, should we get in, that can win not just in the primary, but can win in the general election. Because we think New Hampshire is one of about a dozen states that will be a swing state that could determine the next president. And we don't want to win in a vacuum if we were to run. We want Kelly to come along and be a part of that team. And so we think it's important to have a strong showing, not just in the primary, but in the November election. So we'd love to have you all be a part should we get in. And right now, the early stages are American Revival. If you're interested in knowing more about that, obviously we'll grab you on the way out, or you can go to ouramericanrevival.com. Great.
Crop TV.